reacted to was that I worked in media. That no one actually cared that I was gay, no one cared I was a Muslim, no one cared I was an immigrant, but they all were like, why are you here? What are you going to say about us? That their biggest fear was how I in media, Hollywood liberal media, was going to portray them. Go on in. And so I left that weekend and I was like, well, if I just went into a town full of people who were just like me in all the important ways, different in some ways, but really not what I thought they were, not the homophobic, misogynistic, hateful, anti-immigrant, none of them were, then where's this information coming from? And so I had projects at CNN, and I would go to them and say, what I find so strange is that in the 2 years that Donald Trump was campaigning, how is it possible that not once, even accidentally, did he make a speech that wasn't laughable? Like not once, if you're CNN, the most trusted name in news, how is it that not once he just had a good soundbite that wasn't a joke? And there was this thing that I found soon after where there was Trump was visiting Japan. And it was, I don't know if you know about this, when he was feeding the fish in the koi pond. Okay, so basically he and the Japanese prime minister, and the Japanese prime minister has a thing of food and he uses chopsticks to feed the fish, and Trump uses chopsticks to feed the fish. And then you cut to Trump and he dumps the whole thing into the koi pond. And the headline in CNN was, Trump embarrasses himself and angers local customs. But because I'm a television producer, I was like, wait, that cut seemed not motivated. And the quality of the image, if you work in television, is different. So I went and I searched and found the original footage, which was Japanese Prime Minister uses chopsticks, Trump uses chopsticks. Japanese Prime Minister dumps the food, Trump dumps the food. And I thought, and what they did is they had zoomed in. And this is CNN, probably 3 weeks after the election, 4 weeks after the election. There's enough that he's saying and doing that you don't need to manufacture this. But why? Why are they manufacturing it? Why is someone sitting at the CNN newsroom and basically doctoring footage to create an anti-Trump rageful, when there really is enough stuff out there, you don't need to create more. And so that was when the door opened and I was like, wait a second, if even now everyone's on one side or the other, your news sources are on one side or the other, and I'm sitting at CNN and I'm like, look, I do what you guys do. My job is to keep people watching through the commercials. You have it with this red letter headline. I mean, how often is it always breaking news, always emergency that people will never leave? And CNN, their job is to keep you watching 24 hours a day. And so what they were doing was baiting all day long, get you angrier, get you madder, make sure you stay for the next thing, because they're not half an hour news, they're 24 hours. So you'll need to watch that instead of Real Housewives. How do they get you watching that instead of Real Housewives? And I don't know if you noticed, but if you travel now, there are CNN branded stores in airports. They're doing so well they now have CNN branded stores in airports because they're making so much money off of rage. And so what I decided was, okay, here's what's happening. You have this complete division of information. You have a complete division of a population. The only thing that ever gets to one side about the other is ridiculous and infuriating. But then something happens like a school shooting. And I was like, but this makes no sense. They don't separate the children by who your parents voted for when they shoot. It's in everyone's interest to sit down and say, okay, I don't agree with you, but we have to figure this out. We have to figure this out. And nowhere was that conversation happening. There was nowhere I could find where there was any reasoned, rational conversation about guns. And so what I did in this podcast is I basically found these 7 people, and I said, you are 7 people with 7 different backgrounds: military, NRA, moms, teachers, progressive, liberal, libertarians, conservatives. We're sitting around this table. Your job is to find 5 things you can agree on. Just 5 things. Because if you push past the discomfort, let's see what we can find in the common ground. And this is the biggest thing I'm finding with people, is that conversations are so uncomfortable for people that they avoid them. And the topics that require the most conversation are the topics that we most avoid. And that's really the problem, because there's going to be discomfort. And in my sort of system of how this works, there is discomfort. You're going to be uncomfortable. That's okay, because what we need is to find a way to the other side. Because if you're so worried about offending or being offensive, then we can't ever have the conversation. And only the conversation works once we get past to the other side. So in this group, I brought them together for several hours, and it was about as hot as it is in here because the air conditioning wasn't working there as well. And I found they kept going around and around and around. And one of the things I've learned as I've done these conversations, I've done this in rural Texas and in Alaska and New York and Miami, is because we have so much access to correlating opinions, they aren't useful in these conversations. that if you're sitting there and saying, I think this, but also I read this, and I also read this, and I also read this, we end up building up this wall each side of just correlating opinions that agree with whatever we agree with. And the problem is when you bring in all these outside opinions, those outside opinions don't listen and adjust in the conversation because their edits are locked. And so really in these conversations, the one thing that I've learned is try to avoid referencing everybody else. Because on your thread, we know you have 1,000 opinions that agree with you. But if you keep referencing them, you're not actually listening to the other side because they have 1,000 on their side. And that's what we're having is because we get so much information in the screen world that correlates what we believe in the real world, we come with an army rather than one person to one person. And the conversations only ever work when it's one-on-one. Anytime it's a group, it becomes this, it's like when I do shows with celebrities, if there's some issue that we have, great, we'll go to the trailer, we'll figure out it's all fine. But if they call their manager and publicist and I call my agent, nothing's gonna get solved. It becomes about ego. When we start discussing these projects, these important ideas in groups, it starts to feel like ego, that you don't wanna be wrong. You want anything, but you don't wanna be wrong. And so I find when I go into these conversations, what I tell people is the more in your head you can say, and actually not just in your head, but actually say out loud, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. People constantly are not comfortable saying what they don't know. But if you're really listening to someone else's experience of their life, like I was listening to the fisherman in Alaska, telling me about how he literally sits and drinks a cup of coffee all day because he has no money. His house is on a foundation that's slipping off because he used to be in lumber. Now that's gone. If I was sitting there trying to say, okay, yeah, but Clinton has this, and it wouldn't have worked. And so the problem that I'm finding that people do is they don't actually listen, they wait to speak. And what they do is they refill their arguments with other opinions that they found online. And that doesn't work. The most vulnerable conversations end up being one-on-one. So in this group I put together for the podcast of this group of 7 Americans, we didn't find anything we had in common, nothing of the list. It got fought and fought and fought and spiraled and fought. The one thing we all agreed on was distrust of the government. That was the one thing that the 7 of us had in common, is that we didn't trust the government at this point to get us out of this mess. That we didn't trust that they were leading us the right direction. Which reminded me, because I had lunch with a very, very prominent lobbyist the other day. And I asked him, and I said, look, on the record, I want to ask you a question, but I'm going to give it to you in multiple choice. So you don't have to actually, I won't be quoting you. Is an angrier population better for your business? A, yes. B, no. C, it's more complicated than that. And he said, absolutely A. An angrier population donates more. An angrier population fundraises more. And that's what's wagging the dog, is the fundraising. So the problem is if CNN has a dog in the fight, and your government has a dog in the fight, how do you ever come across people that you don't agree with and have these conversations unless they're artificially produced by a producer saying, I'm gonna make you all sit side by side, and you're gonna be uncomfortable and that's gonna be fine. And I've got cameras on you to make sure you don't walk away. Unless I would do that, everyone would get up and leave. And so it's very strange how you almost have to hold people accountable to stay in the conversation. So in this conversation we didn't find any agreement. But what was interesting is that the Moms Demand Action immigrant Muslim activist was sitting next to the NRA white, she would say self-described redneck trainer at the NRA, and they were talking about the concept of losing someone suddenly. And the NRA, in the end, the mom got choked up, and the NRA trainer got choked up because she's lost a sister and a cousin in a car accident. And so there's this bizarre moment that wasn't planned for, where they happened to be near each other, human to human, where empathy just kicked in. And after the conversation ended the next day, the NRA trainer emailed and said, look, if you want to continue the conversation, why don't you come down to the NRA gun range? I can show you some things that we were talking about, the differences between guns, and we can talk some more. And the mother accepted. And so the next day we went to the NRA gun range, and they sat and chatted, and they went over guns, and this is what we mean. When you say semi-automatic, it means all these guns. It doesn't mean just the ones that go bang, 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 bang. It means all these. And that's why when you're talking about guns, your language isn't quite landing. And so the mom was like, oh, I didn't know that. And she goes, what about the guns that go bang, bang, bang? And she goes, well, that's a bump stock. And the NRA is actually in favor of that being a Class C, which means you need special permission. She's like, I didn't know that. And so the conversation, one-on-one, suddenly opened up. And then they were talking, okay, how do you really feel about background checks? And they found that they agreed somewhat. But what was fascinating to me, and the win for me, was that the conversation was taking place. They talked about their bosses they didn't like. They made a joke about the size of bullets, and that was when the defenses came down. And it really was one-on-one, human to human. They couldn't help but sort of like each other, and then they gave each other the benefit of the doubt, and then they started listening. And when they started listening, they started hearing, oh, I didn't know that that was something that the NRA did. Oh, I didn't know that that's something that you were interested in. I didn't know. And so they found what they had in common. What they didn't have in common was their thoughts about gun laws. But that's okay. And that's the thing that shifted, is that people are not having the conversations now because they believe the only best outcome is if they get the other side to agree with them. That's not the only outcome. The other outcome is the other side hears you, honors what you're saying, but also disagrees with you. That's going to happen. I've sat and had conversations with people who are anti-gay marriage. Of course I have to. I ignore them? That's not an option. If I believe I'm so right, I want to go in and try and explain to you. That doesn't mean that I get everyone to agree on my side. But the conversation still has to happen. I'm constantly talking to people who are have been anti-gay in their lives, because I'm like that. Unless you see the embodiment, the humanization of what it means, rather than stuff you see on the news, what other experience do you have? Like Ketchikan, Alaska, no one had met a Muslim. The only information they had about Muslims was from the news, which that's not the best PR for Muslims, is what's coming on the news. So having the conversation and the humanization of each side is what really is necessary. The agreement is not. The agreement is not always going to happen, but that doesn't mean that the conversation doesn't happen. And so what was interesting is, since this podcast, the NRA trainer has gone to the Moms Demand Action's activist meetings. They've actually attended it. And she's gone back with Moms Demand Action to the NRA to go and actually learn about guns and gun safety and the kinds of things that they can do. Because they say they're really not anti-gun, we're just anti-gun violence. And so they found a common ground. Now, I really, without giving myself so much credit, I cannot imagine this happening anywhere else if I had not arbitrarily said, okay, you guys sit in a room next to each other and be near each other for 3 hours. And somehow in that 3 hours, a moment of human connection happened. If people don't do that, there is no connection. And without the connection, the human connection, we just go to spitting out sound bites. And so we end up in conversations that are just like posting. I post to you what I feel, then you post what you feel, then I post what I feel. Why are we doing it verbally? We're not even listening. We might as well just do it on screen. And yes.
You're okay with questions?
Yes.
Okay. I have two. One is